Good morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast, the first Dubcast of November for Monday, November 3rd, coming off of another dominant Ohio State football victory, 38-14 over the not arrival Penn State Nittany Lions. Ohio State now 8-0, and to talk about what was a game that I think largely delivered on expectations and satisfaction, given a lot of the different narratives going into it. I'm joined by our senior producer at 11 Warriors, Chase Brown. Chase, how was your weekend? Did you enjoy the performance from the Buckeyes?
Yeah, this weekend was great. Noon game at Ohio Stadium. I know that's not something that most people take a lot of enjoyment in, but I feel like the atmosphere was still pretty good. Felt like most of the fans engaged with the blackout theme that they were going for. And there was some pretty fun things happen at the shoe, like Brutus entered into the stadium on a zip line, and Jeff Sabota and Rob Gronkowski recreated their iconic picture almost 19 years later. And then obviously the game was entertaining for Ohio State fans, I'm sure, watching the team win 38-14 against not a rival, as you mentioned, Penn State. So yeah, it was certainly a lot of fun.
Well, it was technically in the Big Ten rivalry series, so I guess it was
Yeah,
supposedly a rival.
it's
That
right.
being said, yeah, maybe supposedly a rival is where we land on between the not a rival and actually a rival narrative, but they're not going to play again for, I think, 3 years after this. So if it really was that fierce of a rivalry, you would think that we would see them again. And depending on who they hire as a head coach, we may not see them in the Big Ten championship anytime soon either. So it's going to be a while, I think, before we get our coveted dose that's become kind of an annual tradition of a Nittany Lion beatdown. So cherish this one because the next one's not probably going to come for a little bit. But yeah, some exciting stuff. I will say, relative to stuff that was happening at the stadium, I was very jealous that I saw at the Coastal Carolina game this past weekend. They had a medieval times sword fighting routine that they did on the field at Coastal Carolina for the Chanticleers. And as much as I like the marching band performances, I feel like we could serve to maybe spice things up or diversify the routines a little bit every now and then. Maybe give the band a bye week, And even though
Yeah.
I know they just had one with the team, and yeah, I think I certainly wouldn't turn my nose up at a Columbus medieval times routine at Ohio Stadium. So maybe just
I'm pretty
something to
sure
consider.
I'm pretty sure Coastal Carolina is the school too that gives away the free concessions items, right? They give
That's
away like
correct.
free soda and hot dogs and
That's right.
popcorn, and
Yeah.
gosh, that'd be a pretty entertaining event then. Go grab all your free stuff and go watch a medieval event. I'd love to see that.
I can't imagine with the size of the operation at the shoe that they would be able to match that standard, but I have to
Oh,
imagine
heck no.
if you're somebody that's a Chanticleers fan, you have a pretty good game day experience. And there's certainly, I as Ohio State is constantly seeking to improve theirs has been a point of emphasis under Ross Bjork. It certainly wouldn't hurt to borrow from the more successful ones across college football. Although the improvements I think that they've made this year have largely been well received. That being said, we will get into the game itself, but before we do that, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor at the 11 Dubcast and 11 Warriors this Ohio State football season. That would be First Bank of Central Ohio. From game day to work day, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. So, Chase, the talking point going into this game, uh, obviously Penn State was preseason number two. A lot of things happened between. I mean, go figure. It's been 2 months since the season started at this point, over 2 full months. A lot of things kind of fell apart for Penn State, and they are now on a 5-game losing streak. But obviously, preceding the fifth loss to Ohio State was a series of 4 losses where after the third one, they fired James Franklin, and subsequently, they had fallen out of the top 10 previously during that stretch. It was a bad October for the Nittany Lions, all things considered, and November certainly didn't start any better. They went from being, I think, roughly 3.5 point underdogs when the betting lines originally opened for this game at the season's outset to being roughly 20 and a half point favorites around the time the lines kind of refocused at the beginning of the week. And then there's some there was some public money, I think, that was steadily creeping the line back and that was narrowing it a little bit. But ultimately, uh, as Brett McMurphy likes to say, good teams win, great teams cover. And Ohio State once again beat the spread this season. They are, I think, the only loss they took against the spread was against Ohio by half a point. Penn State subsequently has only beaten the spread once. That was in the game against Iowa, where they needed a blocked field goal return for a touchdown before halftime in order to do that. Otherwise, they lost by 1 point to Iowa outright. But I only bring up the betting lines as a point of emphasizing that this was expected to be a much closer game. Then the expectation became Ohio State needs to blow this team out. Started, maybe it seemed like they were going to get out to a pretty fast start. And then right before halftime, where you're thinking, okay, Ohio State, they're in a good position to, with the game being 17-7, they can run the 2-minute drill, go get a quick strike in the end zone. They get the ball back to start the second half. They can go get another score, and they can really put some distance and points between these teams. Which, given that Penn State, their best remaining player at this point, Katron Allen, was somebody they wanted to feed as many carries as possible, as was reflected in the fact that he touched the ball nearly 30 times against Iowa. You would think that they were going to want to keep the score as close as possible to stay out of a throwing script, especially given Ethan Grunkmeyer was not, even though he's probably happy in some respects to be making a return to Columbus. This was only his second career start as a true freshman. You have to imagine that pressure would get to just about anybody. And even though he played better, I think, in this game than he did in the Iowa game, he was missing a lot of open throws. He was not throwing well on the run. They were going to need to lean on Katron Allen if they were going to make this game close. And it was a 3-point game going into the half because they tried to hand the ball off to start the 2-minute drill. And CJ Donaldson, they didn't blow forward progress. Whether or not you agree or disagree with that decision, ball got stripped out, recovered by Penn State. They capitalized with a touchdown. Then Ohio State comes out in the second half with their hair on fire, and they really just put this game away. Penn State doesn't score again after that. And Julian Sayin, fresh off of what many people called his most impressive performance against Wisconsin, arguably has an even more impressive performance, ending with just 3 incompletions on 23 passing attempts, 316 yards, 4 touchdowns. Obviously, that last one was helped out by one of the most brilliant plays of Jeremiah Smith's career, which is saying something given the wealth of one-handed catches he's had at this point. So I think I've provided a pretty robust summary of everything that happened, but I'm curious, you have the floor now. Given everything that I just threw at you, did this game satisfy your expectations? Did you see enough blood drawn on Jim Knowles in his return to Columbus, or was there anything that left you wanting a bit more, or areas where you hopefully want to see the Buckeyes improve coming off this performance?
Yeah, I guess the way I would answer that question is maybe a few different directions, but the one that sticks at the front of my mind is this. You and I have talked over the past few Mondays about Ohio State's toughest test leading up to the Michigan game. And we had wondered, would Penn State be that formidable test? Could UCLA rise to the occasion? I think we now firmly know, given UCLA's performance against Indiana last week and now having this performance from Ohio State against Penn State, I think we can confidently say that it's going to be Penn State that provided that test, the best out of the 4 opponents that they were facing in their lead up to Michigan. I don't expect Purdue to give Ohio State much of a challenge. I don't expect UCLA to give Ohio State much of a challenge. And I don't expect Rutgers to give Ohio State much of a challenge. But I was impressed, at least in part, by the way that Penn State came out and played in this game, knowing what they faced in terms of Ohio State's talent across the board. I was a little bit surprised about how Jim Knowles chose to defend Ohio State, particularly chose to defend its 2 best players on offense, or I guess 3 best players if you want to include Julian Sayin, Jeremiah Smith, and Carnell Tate, challenging those guys in man-to-man pretty frequently, trying to take the top off or at least create a shell with 4 quarters across the defensive backfield. It didn't really matter because Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith are that good. They just burnt this Penn State secondary. So I will say that it gave me an encouragement or maybe some confidence in Ohio State's game plan for what it could look like on November 29th when this team plays Michigan. I do think that the first half you saw Ohio State put together a string of long, calculated, methodical drives. They go 11 plays, 89 yards. They get a touchdown. They go 11 plays, 71 yards. It stalls out a little bit in the red zone, which ends up resulting in a field goal. But then you really see their next 4 touchdown drives were quick, rapid, fast paced, take the top off the defense. They go 6 for 75, they go 5 for 75, they go 7 for 84, they go 2 for 62. So this was Ohio State, particularly in the second half, because I do think that that fumble obviously cost them another opportunity to go down the field and score. It gave Penn State basically a free 7 points, which I'm sure the defense wasn't too happy about, knowing that they had just given up their first half touchdown of the season, the previous possession to Penn State, that then they had to go back out on the field again and defend within the 20 yards until the end zone. But you saw Ohio State, I think, flex its muscle and show what it can accomplish when it really wants to air it out. Julian Sayin only had to throw the ball 23 times in this game for Ohio State to put up 38 points. I wonder what it would look like if they had him throw a little bit more. I guess we saw that a little bit when Ohio State played Wisconsin. He threw it 41 times, 42 times in that game. But I thought that for Ohio State to come out and show that they can throw it on anybody. Penn State's pass defense was ranked number 5 or number 6 in the nation coming into this contest. I think they really just showed that if they want to, they can enter into that fourth gear. And I think they would be wise to use a similar game plan in Ann Arbor at the end of this month, knowing that they can lean on a defense that continues to look elite, especially against a Michigan offense that didn't look so much, didn't even look close to elite in a 21-16 win over Purdue. So I do think that this game, probably my primary takeaway is that this Ohio State team showed that it can score in any way that it wants to. It's probably building a game plan that it feels comfortable with taking into Ann Arbor at the end of this month.
Yeah, especially with the news that Justice Haynes will be getting surgery for what I believe is a foot injury.
Yep.
You have to wonder if he's even going to be available for the Ohio State game at this point, even though I believe he had stated that that was a goal in spite of, him dealing with this ongoing health issue that I think he's been kind of trying to navigate since the USC game. You wonder if Michigan is proud of itself for handing him the ball nearly 30 times against Michigan State now, knowing that he's probably not going to be
Yeah.
available again for the rest of the regular season. And even though I'm still, I'll believe it when I see it in terms of them delivering the first victory over Michigan in a handful of years. You have to imagine that them missing arguably their best offensive player throughout the season is probably going to hamper them quite a bit and force them to lean on Bryce Underwood a little bit more than they would perhaps want to. But we got a whole month almost between us and Michigan, so we'll get there when we get there. But yeah, I know the theme that we've been talking about has been, which one of these games before the Michigan game is going to test them the most, and it certainly feels like of the handful left that this one was probably the biggest hurdle to clear. That being said, those road trips to West Lafayette, like the one coming up this weekend, are always a little bit weird.
Yeah.
At least the ones at night are, and thankfully this is a 1:00 kickoff. The atypical 1:00 kickoff, as Dan pointed out to me last week in our preview show. So weird kickoff time, weird setting
Mhm.
for Ohio State. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I feel like, especially given the fact that Ohio State probably leaned on the run game a little bit more than they needed to in this one, maybe for perhaps the purposes of salting the clock away. I mean, Bo Jackson didn't even really get half of the amount of carries that they gave to the running backs. It was a little bit less than half than that. And a lot of the other running backs didn't necessarily have great days with the shares of the workload that they did get, other than Jackson. Jackson, even if you take away his 51-yard run, I thought looked very good in this game. So I think it's been very clear at this point that he's kind of cemented himself at the top of that pecking order. It's just a matter of who's going to fill into that number 2 role. And that was something I talked about with Andy last week, that we both feel like we thought Isaiah West was going to get more of an opportunity coming into this game, and he did somewhat, but you wonder how much that fumble for Donaldson, if he's going to be kind of forgiven for that, given the forward progress issue, or if they recognizing they have other options available that they might give Isaiah West a bit more of a look in wake of that. Now, speaking of Dan, we are going to be doing when Dan is on the show Wednesday. We're going to be reacting to the first set of the college football playoff rankings. And I'm going to be recording with him the night before, a little bit later than usual, because he is planning on potentially jumping in the media teleconference for that, depending on what happens with the rankings. Now, a popular talking point going into the weekend before the games were played was that a lot of people had been saying that at that moment, given the resume of Indiana, they would rank Indiana number one in the first set of the rankings. And Dan himself has been somebody that throughout a lot of his recent installments of his Big Ten power rankings has put Indiana number one to the chagrin of the Ohio State audience. Not saying he's incorrect. I think Indiana objectively does have a more impressive resume. But the interesting thing is the sets of rankings that we do have to go off of at this stage, at this point in the season, that being the AP poll and the coaches poll, both polls have consistently ranked Ohio State one in spite of anything impressive that Indiana has done on a weekly basis. I was a little bit worried going into the first half that if Ohio State didn't come out with a sense of urgency, that it felt like their fate was sealed in terms of Indiana debuting in the initial set of rankings as the number one team. They certainly made the case in the second half that they deserve to retain their spot, and that's reflected by the fact that they're still at the top of the polls. So my question for you is, when these rankings come out Tuesday night, do you think that Ohio State has done enough to cement itself at the top, or do you think the expectation should still be what a lot of people were thinking in the national media going into this weekend, which is that Indiana is probably going to be the team that supplants Ohio State, at least in this initial set of rankings? And hopefully both these teams meet in the Big Ten championship and sort out which team should be number one heading into the true postseason.
Yeah, I think you maybe just explained why I guess I don't really care where Indiana or Ohio State appear in this poll because it seems like these two teams are destined to meet in Indianapolis with a Big Ten championship on the line.
That's not going to stop a
Um,
lot of Ohio State fans from
true,
reacting
true.
very angrily if they're not recognized as
Yeah,
number one Tuesday night, which is
and
why I
and
bring this up.
I can relate to those fans in the sense of what more could Ohio State do to earn the respect as the number one team? You mentioned it earlier. They've covered in all of their games but one, and it was a game where they beat Ohio by 28 points, and the spread was 28 and a half. Um, I I don't know what the CFP committee thinks about spreads, but I think that the narrative around a team that good teams win, great teams cover is something that is kind of unanimously held as something that gives a team credit. You should beat a team by a certain number of points. Ohio State is beating the teams that they have on their schedule by a certain number of points. It seems like the Texas win maybe is going to get better with each week. Arch Manning may have found something this week against Vandy. I think there's a lot of chatter around the concussion helping him a little bit, which kind of made me laugh, like thinking about the concussion knocking him into a different mindset that has allowed him to play a little bit better. I do think that, yeah, Texas could provide Ohio State with a little bit more bolster to their resume. Penn State, I understand, is not the team that everyone thought it was going to be at the beginning of the year, but Ohio State, or I guess I should say Ryan Day, has made it clear that they still have talent outside of the quarterback position. And they have NFL guys that chose to come back, and Ohio State pretty much just swept them to the side en route to a 38-14 win. They have that win over Washington on the road, 24-6. They have a win at Illinois on the road. I think that their resume, while it's not as strong as Indiana's, I do think that they have shown that they can beat any opponent across the board. At least they have beaten the opponents on their current schedule the way that they were supposed to. And I think you can point to areas of their game, particularly with their defense and particularly with the way that Julian Sayin is passing the football, that this team has the talent and has the execution worthy of being the number one team in the country. And so
Yeah,
I don't know what that would do for the rest of the season if they get the number one spot and then Indiana continues to look like a bulldozer and then Indiana eventually surpasses them or usurps them. I don't know, but I do think that there is enough there currently where Ohio State has probably enough momentum in the committee's conversations to retain or I guess debut as the number one team after being the number one team in the AP and the coaches poll all these weeks.
yeah, I won't necessarily be surprised or disappointed either way, but I think given the fact that they are the defending national champion, that they have largely satisfied expectations relative to what the public has considered they should be winning by if you use the betting market as a barometer for that. And that the defense has been historically brilliant up to this point in the season, that there's more than enough of a case for them to remain number one. And I would hope that the committee takes a long term look at that in terms of keeping them in that place, and that Indiana will have an opportunity to prove it should be the number one team directly, assuming that both of these teams end up in the Big Ten championship in a handful of weeks, which it seems like both of them are on a trajectory to do. It's just a matter of, is Ohio State going to take care of business against Michigan? And we can all ideally hope for that. But overall, very, very satisfying day. I have to say, and I must apologize to you directly, because when we stopped recording, I think it was last week or maybe the show previous to that, you gave a brilliant hypothetical of what you wanted to see from this game, which was between the first and second or third and fourth quarters that they should have done a video tribute to Jim Knowles as a thank you for all the contributions he made to Ohio State's national championship winning team last year. And
That's right.
I really wish they would have done that between the third and fourth quarters of this game, because the timing with Ohio State running it up at that point would have been
Yeah.
absolutely perfect. And I used that. I gave you credit, but I used that bit on some of the other shows last week when I was talking about Jim Knowles with Dan, and I thought I feel so guilty that I should have reminded Chase to use his bit on the Dubcast. I don't know if he talked about it on 11 Warriors Live or not.
Well, did you see what they ended up doing? They ended up
No.
showing on the scoreboard Matt Patricia and then cutting to Jim
Oh, I
Knowles.
did. Yeah, they
And
juxtaposed the two. I did see that.
anytime Patricia was on the screen, the crowd was cheering, and then they'd throw up Knowles and the crowd was booing, and it was hilarious. It was one of those bits where it started out funny, and then it kind of became like, all right, it's probably time for this thing to end. And then they kept doing it to where it became funny again. And it literally had everyone in the press box laughing. It had everyone in the stadium laughing, I think, too, that wasn't participating, I guess, actively in the cheering and the booing. It was very well done. It was a subtle nod to kind of the tension that had maybe been in the stadium about Jim Knowles' departure and Matt Patricia's arrival. So I thought that was very funny and very well done by the stadium team.
Absolutely. And you can hardly blame them for doing it in a game where Jim Knowles' defense gives up nearly 500 total yards of offense to Ohio State, and Penn State can't even match half of that. They only managed 200 yards on the dot, averaged under 2 yards per carry on the ground, which was presumably going to be their biggest area of success. And yeah, it was just an overall very for the amount of ways that this could have potentially not been satisfying, especially given how the first half ended. I think overall you have to look at this game and think that this was pretty solid, and it sets an interesting stage too for the Heisman Trophy race relative to Julian Sayin and Jeremiah Smith's prospects in that regard. So it'll be interesting to see how they close down the stretch. Obviously, as you alluded to off the top, not necessarily the highest level of competition to worry about. I believe that Ohio State opened as 28.5-point favorites against Purdue next weekend, despite the fact that they're playing on the road, and Purdue is coming off a gritty performance against the Wolverines. I believe that game was in Ann Arbor too. So probably one of, if not the best performance that Purdue has had to this point in the season. So it'll be interesting to see if they carry over the momentum from that game into this next one with Ohio State. But we'll preview that game on Friday's show. We'll have plenty more to talk about coming out of this game this week with Kyle Jones tomorrow, as we tease the next episode of Film Study that'll drop on Thursday. And then, as I said, we will have Dan on for the Wednesday episode to talk about the first edition of the CFP rankings, which Chase and I are optimistically hoping Ohio State is still number one, but don't get too bent out of shape if Ohio State is slighted by the national media that despises the defending national champions and drops them to number two, because all in due time it'll all even out, and we're playing for the postseason to make sure the team is in the best shape possible going in. The number next to them not going to matter if they end up beating all the teams they need to down the stretch. And thankfully, Ryan Day and the rest of this group recognizes that, given what happened last year. So thanks for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow with Mr. Jones. Chase, thank you for joining me. Thank you for tuning in. And thanks to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio. And we'll see you tomorrow. Take care, folks.